slides.
Thank you.
And our Toastmaster is one of the people at the remote location, so.
Are you by yourself, Karen, or is there somebody else there?
Nope, I'm all by myself at beautiful downtown Kennewick Library branch.
I thought Jacek was
I did
going.
too. I thought Jacek and oh.
Yeah, there's nobody here.
Hi.
Where is Jacek? He's one of our speakers. Okay, well, we should probably. Victoria said she'd be here.
No, Victoria's a last minute kind of person.
Where are we at on time? We're getting it's close.
Yep.
It is.
Oh, Vicki Chatterton was having computer problems and she was interested in calling in, so she might come in by phone.
I just got an email. I'm not where I can hear very well, so I would not be a good choice for evaluator.
Who is that?
Victoria Chatterton.
Oh.
All right, so I guess since Victoria is not available at the moment and I am now the presiding officer, and it is 1 o'clock Central Washington time, we'll go ahead and kick this meeting off. We are missing a few people, unfortunately, but we will still strive to hold a very nice meeting. Without any further hesitation, we will skip the presentation or the pledge to the flag since we do not have one. I don't have one in my room right here. I will just welcome up our Toastmaster for today, Karen Mobley. Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome. Thank you, Deborah. We've got a great speaker on tap for today. Our chat box moderator is Kathy Hansen. And before I turn things over to Kathy, I'd like to tell you something about our speaker. Ellie Kay is the best-selling author of 15 books, including Lean Body, Fat Wallet, and Heroes at Home. She is a Toastmaster accredited speaker and distinguished Toastmaster, as well as a popular international speaker and media veteran who has given over 2,800 media interviews, including appearances on ABC, CNBC, CNN, and Fox News. As a popular columnist, she writes for 6 National Magazine and has been a subject matter expert for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Washington Post. Currently, Ellie provides financial education to military members through her Heroes at Home financial event, sponsored by donations to this 501c3. Ellie is married to LTC Bob Kay, and they have 7 children. Please help me welcome Kathy Hansen as she explains what being the chat box moderator means, and we segue to our accredited speaker, Ellie Kay.
Okay, well, we have a chat box. You should find the control for it either at the top or the bottom of your screen. And if you have a question as we're going along, you can type it into the chat box, and at the end we will present Ellie with any questions we have. And And Karen, did you want to go ahead and do the final piece of the introduction, or would you like me to do that?
I will go ahead and allow you to take over that last little piece of the intro.
Okay, please help me welcome Ellie Kay.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Well, it's really great to join you virtually, and I'm looking forward to our time together. So since this is a little bit different than what I'm used to, I'll just chat with you guys rather than a big formal speech where I'm standing on a stage, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have. All right, if we want to move on to the first slide.
Well, that's interesting. Why won't it do it? Oh, there we go.
Today we're going to be talking about power talkers, and I believe that you can become a power talker by learning the ABCs of public speaking. And as we're talking about accredited speakers, I believe that if you become the best professional speaker that you can and ascribe towards that goal, then that will help you in your role to become an accredited speaker. One of the things that I talk about is our family. And with my family, when I met my husband many, many years ago, he said, let's join the active duty military and we can see the world. He already had 2 beautiful daughters at the time, my stepdaughters. And then we proceeded to have 5 babies in the first 7 years of marriage for a total of 7 children. And then we moved 11 times in 13 years. So we took the show on the road. And I learned at a very early point in our marriage that I was going to have to learn to look at life in a funny way, or I was going to end up on the funny farm. And my kids are really ones that help us do that. In fact, Joshua, when the youngest boy, when he was 4 years old, I used to take one of the kids at a time to go run errands. And we were running errands one day, and we went to the post office, and he told the clerk there, something about, my name is Joshua and I'm really good at sports because I can score goals in soccer. And the clerk said, wow, that's really nice. And then we went to the grocery store and he was helping put things on the belt. And the cashier looked at him and said, my goodness, you're a really big helper. And he goes, yeah. And not only that, but I'm smart. I can write my name, Joshua. And I thought, okay, it's a confident kid. And so we go home and he disappears. And I don't know if any of you have ever had 4-year-olds, but when they disappear for more than 20 minutes, you probably need to go looking for them. And I found him upstairs and he was just looking in a mirror and he was just gazing at his reflection. And I said, son, what are you doing? And he says, Mama, have you ever noticed how handsome I am? And I said, okay, son, we need to have a talk. I said, son, I know that you're good at sports and you're smart, but you can't go around telling people that, because if you do, that comes across as arrogant. And you want to be confident, but you don't want to be arrogant. So you can't tell people that yourself. So he sat there and he thought about for a minute and he said, you know what, Mama? I really think I must be arrogant because I know I'm smart. I know I'm good at sports and I know I'm good looking. And so that is the son that grew up to join the Army, and he is well suited in that place right now. So the point of that story is basically that we can be confident in our speaking skills by developing the ABCs of speaking success. And it's important in that journey that we follow that confidence and never let it venture over into arrogance. So let's go on to our next slide. And let's just talk for a minute. You guys can interact with this if you will. What does it mean to you when you hear the word power talker? Let's hear from some of you guys if you want to unmute.
Somebody who's persuasive.
Right? That's good.
I always think of someone who doesn't ever pause.
Oh, that is a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Just like powers through. Good. Anybody else have any thoughts about what a power talker means when you first hear that?
One thought I had was just someone who dominates the conversation.
Right. Yeah, that could definitely be called a power talker. Well, let's go on to the next slide, and I'll give you my definition of what, for the context of today's presentation, what I mean by a power talker. And it's basically just someone who uses powerful words to affect lives in a positive way. So when we hear power talker in this context, it's a positive thing because it's changing lives for the better. Let's look at our next slide and we'll see some examples of power talkers that we all know. One of the most impactful speakers that we've ever had has been also known as a great communicator, and that was Ronald Reagan. And one of the things that he always said was to trust but verify. And when our kids were teenagers, they really learned to hate that phrase from Ronald Reagan, because when they wanted to go to parties or when they wanted to go hang out with their friends, we would trust them, but we had to verify where they were, when they were going to be back, and what they were doing. So that is a really great example of that. And he also used humor. And the day that he got shot, you may recall the story that when he was being rushed to the hospital and he was in the ER and they were rushing him to surgery, he looked up and he said, "I sure hope you guys are Republicans." And the doctor said, "Mr. President, today everyone is a Republican." And that's a very powerful message, even in the midst of great difficulty. We also have Michelle Obama, and she learned to communicate not only in formal speeches, but in informal ways to really reach her public. You may have seen her on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, where she did little sketches where she was a little girl. So that's just another form of communication. And then, of course, Mother Teresa. She was a great communicator, and she talks about how we never know all the good that a simple smile can do. And I think that's a great word for professional communicators, is to smile whenever possible, because that communicates a lot. All right, the next thing that I'd like to look at is the power of a good title. Now, our family has a lot of cult films that we watch. Zoolander is one of them. If you've never seen it and you would like to laugh, I would encourage you to do that. But here's his idea of a title: the Center for Adults Who Don't Speak Good and Want to Do Other Things Good Too. So that's really probably not the best title that you might have for a center, a foundation that he was going to open to help children read. And I think that talks a little bit about the power of a good title. It's important, before we get into our ABCs, we're going to get into those in just a minute, but we need to talk about the power of a good title. A good title is one that intrigues, it motivates the audience to want to attend your event. It gives them an idea about what the speech is about without giving away the entire speech, and it leaves some mystery to it. Were any of you guys at the World Champion of Public Speaking last year? If so, just raise your hand and we'll see. Okay, look, so there were some of you that were there. And I just wanted to share those titles. Anita Fain Taylor was the third runner-up, and the title of her speech is "It Is What It Is." And then she carried that out in a beautiful way for those of you that saw that. The second place was Ziffany Sue, and she had as her title "Turn Around." And as expected, she used her body language throughout that speech, and she carried through that title in her entire presentation. And then the winner was Ramona Smith, and her title was "Still Standing." And that is a theme that she used, and it was a good, strong, solid title. And of course, she won first place. One other quick title I want to share from a past world champion of public speaking is Dana Lamont. Dana Lamont is one of only two people that have both the world champion under his belt as well as accredited speaker. And the title of his award-winning speech the year that he won was, does anyone know what that was? Anyone here happen to know? Okay. The title of his speech was "And the Winner Is." Isn't that great? So when they mention, in the protocols, "and the winner is Dana Lamont, and the winner is." And so I don't know if it was subliminal that year, but he did win. So it's important to have a great title. It's also important to have a great speech introduction. And when it comes to your introduction as a professional, make sure that it answers a couple of questions: who you are, and why they should listen to you. So in different settings, it might be different. I'm a financial expert. And when I give an introduction for that financial background, I tend to stress a lot more in the introduction that has to do with finances. Today, the introduction was a little bit more Toastmasters centric, and it talked a little bit about things that would appeal to Toastmasters. So make sure that you have a good introduction, even if it's just in a meeting, but especially if it's out in the marketplace, that answers who you are and why they should listen to you. Also, if you have a credibility of some kind, and you've done a lot of things, it's far better for that to come out in your introduction rather than to say, I wrote 15 books, and I've spoken over 2,000 times for hire, and I've been on 2,800 media interviews. No matter how you work that in, it just sounds arrogant. And we don't want to sound arrogant. We want to sound confident. So make sure that your introduction does all of that. All right, let's move on to the ABCs. The speaking ABCs are, they're accurate, they're brief, and they're clear. And whether you're speaking at a congressional event, and you'll see one of my pictures where I've spoken at, actually I've spoken at a lot of congressional events, or you might be speaking at an event with 10,000 people in it. The one on the bottom is me speaking to an arena event with 10,000 people that had a huge set and a huge stage. Or you might even be speaking at the White House podium. And you'll see a picture there of me at the White House podium, but I have to reveal that that's actually the gift shop. So anybody could go in there at the gift shop and get a picture behind that podium. So I haven't actually spoken at the White House yet. But at any rate, no matter what it is, it's important to be accurate, brief, and clear. So let's unpack that a little bit. The first one, A, is for accuracy. Today, anyone can just sit in your audience and question what you might be saying if you're recounting facts or if you're giving a quote or whatever, and they can immediately tell whether you're accurate or not. And if you give information that's inaccurate, you're immediately going to lose credibility. So it's important that you do your research, that all your data is accurate and up to date. When in doubt, don't. So if you think you have a quote or someone said it or whatever, you can't give attribution, then don't do that in a public venue, but make sure that all of your facts are correct. Let's look at another part of being accurate, which means knowing your audience. Let's go to the next slide. And I know in Toastmasters, we talk a lot about knowing your audience, but here's a higher level of knowing your audience. We're talking to professionals. A lot of you want to become accredited speakers. You may already be professional speakers, but it's important that you know your audience. And when it comes to knowing your audiences, I think I have another slide. There we go. So it's important to ask the event planner, wherever you're going, who will be there? Will the media be there? Will there be women, men, mixed groups? What's the generational makeup looking like? Are you going to be speaking mostly to millennials, or are you going to have Gen X and boomers there as well? It's important to know all of these kinds of things. It's also important to kind of have a good idea of what kind of communicators they are. So this fall, I'm going to be speaking at the AFCPE, which is the Accredited Financial Counselors Accreditation Bureau. And they have a convention every year. And they want their presentations to be scholarly and scientific. So in that particular audience, I'm going to be sharing a lot of numbers and statistics and quoting where these statistics come from. In a regular audience with just a makeup of other people that are not a part of that association, I probably wouldn't use all of those numbers and everything, but I will in that setting. Also, what is the education level of your audience? Are they mostly high school grads? Are they college grads? What is that kind of the background? Because it's important to choose the words that you're going to be using that you can communicate adequately with them. So one of the things that I do, just kind of to spark joy, is I have a podcast. And my daughter and I, it's the Money Millhouse, and my daughter and I are co-hosts on it. And we have multi-generational audiences, but we largely have millennial audiences. And so it's kind of about mama, money, and me. and she's asking me questions about finances. She knows a lot herself. But at one point during one of our recent podcast episodes, she talked about, YOLO. And I had no clue what YOLO was. I said, does anyone know out there what YOLO is? If you do, just raise your hand. YOLO. You know, Kathy, it's you only live once. And so she shared that with me, and then we made a joke of it because I kept saying, YOLO, and she just thought it was hilarious. So that was a way to connect with our millennials in the audience, even if it's just kind of poking fun at yourself, to be able to do that. So that is really important, and know your audience. That's part of being accurate. So let's move on to the next one, which is brevity. So when it comes to giving a professional speech, but also when it comes to passing accredited speaker, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about as I'm sharing with you guys. Speech or organization is important, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I know that I'm talking to a group of advanced Toastmasters that are maybe aspiring to accredited speakers, so you know all this part about speech organization. And yet, here's the amazing thing. Sometimes in the accredited speaker engagement that I see, or especially in the films that are submitted ahead of time that maybe don't make it to level 2, it's like some of the speech organization just kind of fades away. In fact, the people that don't pass are ones that are lacking in that structure where the judges can't decide, what's your 3 points? What exactly were you telling us? So it is important to have that very clear organization. It's important to open with something humorous. And this is true for no matter what audience that you're at, but especially true for the professional level. When you have an introduction, making sure that it really is something that engages people. And then 3 main points, and of course a snappy conclusion, one that leaves them wanting a little bit more. One of the things that I do, even as a professional speaker, having given over 2,000 paid speeches, I still have feedback. Because as regular speakers, we can have certain words that creep in. And all of a sudden, these become crutch words. And they become distracting and annoying. And you sometimes never even know that that's happening. So I will have my director of communications that travels with me give me an evaluation, because I really trust her evaluation. And that feedback helps on a lot of levels. The feedback will say, hey, I noticed the audience really laughed at this particular joke. And if I have to shorten something for the accredited speaker presentation, if you have to shorten something and you're taking a 45-minute speech and you're condensing it down to the required 20 minutes or so, then you may have to cut some things out. So with the proper feedback, it's like, don't cut out this joke because it gets a laugh every time I see the audience responding to it. So feedback is not just, hey, that didn't work, or you said, 15 times, or things like that. Sometimes it's what you did right so that you can continue to do it. And I will say this, when I went to the accredited speakers last year and I saw that particular presentation, I noticed that the people that didn't pass were the people that had the hardest time shaving a 45-minute presentation down to 20 minutes. That is the biggest challenge for professional speakers that are wanting to pass the accredited speaker, because they don't know what to take out and what to leave in. And so good feedback in this way can kind of help you as you're going up to that higher level. And speaking to the idea of uhs and ums, I was on CNBC once, and it was a 2.5-minute interview. And believe it or not, I said, that's right, 7 times in 2.5 minutes. That's right. That's right. That's right. And it was so annoying. It was terrible. So that will help you from doing that. And of course, as I go out and I speak in communities, I always encourage people to go to Toastmasters.org to get more information about that. All right. It is time for our C. C is for clarity. And when it comes to clarity, let's make sure that our objectives are met. Stephen Covey says that you begin with the end in mind. And when it comes to writing a speech, what is your end game? What are you wanting people to be able to remember, to take away? What are you wanting to communicate? One of those that past the accredited speaker was an individual that gave CPR. What do you think his goal was? It was to save lives. It was to help people that sat in on the presentation to be able to give and administer CPR, even just out in the world, to be able to save lives if you're called on to do that. For me, my accredited speaker speech was Heroes at Home, and the audience was a military audience. I knew who my audience was. I even said that in my introduction, that when they introduced me, they said, for the purposes of today's speech, you are not a Toastmasters audience. You are an audience filled of military members and their families. And my objective and goal for them when I give Heroes at Home is for them to walk away feeling that America loves them and appreciates them. So think about what your objective is every time that you create a speech. And in that creation, make sure that you use relevant examples. So if you're speaking to millennial audiences, something, a TV show, ER, is something they've never even heard of. So make sure that your examples are relevant to the audience that you're talking to, and that they can really apply that in their lives so that it will make them clear. Whenever you give an example, it is something, it's a different way of saying what you just said. So you give a story to be able to do that, even as I have done throughout this speech. And then, of course, part of clarity is the call to action. And from this speech, I want you to know what the ABCs are. That will be the call to action. And in the future, when you give speeches, to make sure that they're accurate, brief, and clear, so that you will know those things. And when it comes to giving professional speeches, or even giving speeches in Toastmasters, I can tell the people who stand up and the very first time they gave that speech is at that meeting. And that's not the mark of someone that ascribes to excellence. You need to be giving all of your speeches, whether they're 5 to 7 minutes or whether they're 45 minutes, in their entirety at least 3 times. To the couch, to the mirror, just in your car. I guess if you have a long commute, you don't have to look at your notes when you're trying to drive. But at some point, go over that speech at least a minimum of 3 times, and maybe even 5. And before you record something to submit it to the accredited speaker program, practice. But don't practice it until it makes perfect. Practice until it makes permanent. You want to practice enough to where not just the idea of you get it right, but that you can't get it wrong. When I presented my Heroes at Home speech to the accredited speaker program, I had given that speech 100 times. And the night before, I wanted to pay homage to my hero, my husband, and my hero at home, which was my daughter, because they were in the audience for the first time, and they're usually not in my audiences. And they were both there at Caesar's Palace in 2015 when I went for accredited speaker. And so I had to change that speech that I had that was already permanent in my mind, and I had to change about 2 minutes of it. And I practiced that in the middle of the night for an hour. So I took 2 minutes and I practiced it over and over and over and over again. And so that is the mark of a professional and the mark of someone who wants to get it right. So let's move on to the home stretch of what I wanted to talk about today. And that is difficult gigs, difficult audiences. And in Pathways, I know that they have a project. Have any of you guys seen this in Pathways yet? Raise your hand and let me know if you have, where they have a project that teaches you how to deal with interruptions and difficult audiences. Have you seen that? Anybody? Okay. Yes, there we go. I see someone down at the bottom that has seen that. And they manufacture this. A lot of times a Toastmaster will give someone in the meeting a cue, a role, and then that person interrupts and things like that. And I guess that's good for some kind of practice. But in our group, our Shop Talk Toastmasters, our people catch on real quickly. We have about 35 members, and we usually have about 20 people showing up to meetings. And one person was giving this kind of a project speech, and then other people in the audience just took it upon themselves to become difficult and to add to that difficulty. So they actually had some spontaneity in it to where they actually had to deal with these difficult audiences. So a couple of my most difficult audiences I've had in the 20 plus years that I've been speaking professionally was Shamuatorium. So this is about 10 years ago when Barbara Bush was supposed to come and address the Military Spouse of the Year down in San Antonio at Shamuatorium. And the week before the event, her Secret Service detail said, we cannot secure the former First Lady's safety, so she can't come. So they called me in to give this at the last minute. So it was a difficult audience because, number one, I wasn't Barbara Bush, and that's what they were hoping for. So they were incredibly disappointed when I showed up. And number two, the acoustics of the venue was, and welcome to Shamuatorium. Oh, well, we are so glad. I mean, the acoustics were reverberating constantly. And can you imagine trying to give a 20-minute speech with those kinds of things going on? And then to make it just a little bit more interesting, the third thing that happened was all the kids in the audience, because these were military families, were told that they couldn't watch the Shamu show until the speaker quit speaking, until I was done. So they were all like, just get it over with already. We want to see this going on. So I was trudging through it, trying to get through it, and I had to slow down my speaking. That's one adjustment that I made for that difficult venue that I was facing. The second thing that I did was I cut my speech. There's no way I'm going to go on for 20 minutes. And they were not upset with me. The event planners were not bothered that I cut it to 10 minutes. So I just, on the fly, I got the most essential, critical things that were needed to be said in that moment, and I cut it in half. And as I was trudging through this speech, there were points of my speech when everybody in the audience goes, oh, wow. Oh, and I thought, wow, maybe I'm doing better than what I thought I was doing, until during one of those key moments, I look behind me and I see that Shamu is making a pass in the tank. So every time Shamu would come back, then everyone would get excited, and I was being constantly upstaged by a whale. And so that was a difficulty. Another difficult audience I had was, we speak to military audiences. Lots of times we have captive audiences. So these are 18 to 22-year-olds that have been told they're going to go listen to this Heroes at Home financial brief for 2 hours. And in one case, they were even told that dinner was canceled, and instead of that, they were going to go listen to this. So that's a rough audience, and it's really tough. But we have a high-energy millennial MC. You'll see her at the bottom there, bottom right, who is my daughter. And she gets the energy up, and she keeps it going. So in our briefings, we give 3 speakers that talk about finances, but then I hit the home run. And the home run is my traditional Heroes at Home speech, which has nothing to do with money and everything to do with how much we appreciate our military members and how important they are to us. And I have sometimes new speakers that are on my docket that I haven't necessarily vetted them ahead of time. And USAA had sent a new speaker to us once, and he wasn't as comfortable with an audience, or he had a different format that he uses. And so instead of just teaching them about investments in retirement, he actually got them all worked up. And it didn't take a lot to get these 18 to 22-year-olds worked up. And they were yelling out things and screaming. And so by the time I got them, they're like hyper. Okay, so not only are they difficult, but they're hyper. And I have to go into a very serious message. And at one point, I talk about life and death. And so the first characteristic is a sense of humor. So I thought, okay, I'll use this time in this first characteristic to kind of take that energy that they have and to settle it down a little bit so that they can listen to the next item that I'm going to talk about. And I did that, and they were still really worked up. And so now I'm at the point where they really have to settle down. And so on the fly, the thing that I decided to do was address the issue with them. And all I did was I just stopped talking. And I stood on the stage and I looked at them. And then I took the microphone and I put it close to my mouth and I gave them a mama look that I've perfected with 7 kids. And I just looked out at this audience of 800 young service members and I went like this. Shh. And they got quiet. They got instantly quiet and it worked. So that was an example of how I handled that. Let's go on to the next slide because that actually dovetails what we were talking about. Is when it comes to difficult audiences, you can sometimes address it. There are different ways to handle them. And addressing them in that venue was an appropriate one. There was another time when we did a lot of work with the Navy SEALs, and at the venue where we were at, there was alcohol being served. It was a hotel, and they could order drinks, and there were young pups. That's what we call the Navy SEALs that are very young, and they were in the back of the room, and they were drunk. And I'm trying to give a financial brief, and they were loud, and they were boisterous, and the leadership in the room wasn't taking charge of it. So I just asked for the senior enlisted command to go ahead and would you go ahead and just take those members out to the bar? And I think they're going to have a lot more fun out there because the rest of us really need to hear the brief that we're talking about before this deployment in regards to finances. And they took them out and it was fine. So that's a little bit awkward to have to address things directly. Sometimes you ignore it. So basically we're taking aim. You're going to address it, you're going to ignore it, or you're going to modify it. And sometimes you will have a disruption that you just kind of ignore and you let the community take care of it. So there was a venue where a baby started crying and I ignored it for a little bit, and then people in the community, you could see them talking to the mom and saying, hey, and someone took the baby out and that took care of itself. So it's kind of just evaluating the moment that you're in and kind of trusting your gut as to how to handle that particular thing. And then the last thing is to modify. And the example of that was Shamuatorium, where I took a 20-minute speech and I modified it to be able to be 10 minutes. So you might have to modify on the fly. There may be an example that you're going to use or a story that you realize, oh my gosh, this audience won't like this. So you modify it because to share that story could make it even more difficult in that particular audience. And so that's basically a way that you can take aim to be able to do that. As we're wrapping up, I want to encourage you that as you are out there developing a professional speech and giving it over and over with an eye to become an accredited speaker, that it's really important that you know the ABCs to make sure that you're accurate, brief, and clear. And as you do that, I think you're going to find that you will have a lot of success in this area. And I want to leave you with another quote from Ronald Reagan. And that is that you can use humor in a lot of situations to be able to make things stick. And you can even use it when you want to have self-deprecating humor to be able to garner the attention of your audience. And I love when he was being criticized for his age because they were saying he was too old to run for president again. And you guys may have remember what he said, but he announced to the media, I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. So as you go out, become a power talker. Be a person who will use powerful words to affect change in a positive way.
Thank you so much, Ellie. We do have a question.
Okay.
This is from Deborah. She says, I struggle with feeling like my message is stale when I give it over and over. Now, I can really relate to this too, because I get sick of my speeches. How do you fight that feeling with the practice till permanent idea?
Well, when it comes to giving speeches, there's a difference between practicing it and then actually delivering the same speech to audience after audience after audience after audience. Okay, so there are two different kinds of things. I'm not saying that you have to practice it 60 times like I did that particular change that I made before I went up for accredited speaker. But I am saying that you give your speech at least 3 to 5 times. And I don't think that's what you're talking about. I don't think you're talking about practicing it 3 to 5 times to where you really have it down and can be able to speak that. I think you're talking more about the idea of giving the same speech over and over again. And so when it comes to giving the same speech over and over again, I try to change up my anecdotes. So you don't have to use the same anecdotes. They may be really good and they may work, but you try a new one, try a fresh one. And that's what Toastmasters is for. So I take my new jokes, my new anecdotes, and my new poignant stories that are designed to make people cry. They're designed to elicit an emotion. I take all of those and I practice them in another speech in front of my shop talk family. And if they don't laugh at it, then it's not funny. So I won't want to put that into an old speech, a new joke or a new anecdote if people aren't laughing at it. And then number 2, if this one woman in the group doesn't tear up when I tell a poignant story, one that's designed to elicit emotion, then I won't use it because she cries at everything. So that's a good way to do it. So try to use new anecdotes, new quotes, and new examples, even if the rest of your material is the same, and that will help insert some freshness into an old canned speech that you may give over and over.
Wonderful. I just had a couple of comments. Number one, when you were talking about speech titles in the World Championship, I thought about the 2016 World Championship and Aaron Beverly, who had a speech title that was somewhere between 40 and 50 words. And so when the Toastmaster, who I believe was Raj Arunasalam, had to announce it, of course he had to repeat those 40 to 50 words twice. And Aaron came in, I believe, 3rd. And I really think that the title had something to do with that, because I mean everybody thought it was hilarious that he had this incredibly long title.
Yeah, was it designed for that way? Was it designed to be funny?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And the other thing is, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate that you talked about audience, because I think that that's something that we don't really look at enough in Toastmasters, and certainly not the difficult audiences. You know, that's a really fresh perspective, and I really appreciate that. I used to be a speech writer for a Florida elected official, and every time I wrote a speech for her, I had to go through an audience analysis process, and I actually had to attach a form to every speech that was an audience analysis that talked about, you know, what time of day the speech would be given, how the audience would be seated, the demographics of the audience. And I remember one time where I wrote what must have been a very simplistic speech at kind of a lower level, and she wrote at the bottom of it, "These are attorneys," in the audience. She obviously understood the audience a lot better than I did at that particular speech. But again, I really appreciate your talk about audience.
Yeah, and in the 20 years that I've been speaking, I've had a lot of difficult audiences, and there was only one time when I almost walked off the stage.
Wow.
Because of that, and it was a women's symposium, and they had set up a venue inside of an acoustically difficult room. That was a horrible room to set it up in. It was this big cavernous type of pavilion, and they had set up the vendors right next to it. So there were women shopping and talking and laughing, and then the stage was set right next to that, so people could barely hear me. And as I watched them, there wasn't another speaker, but there were other people that were making announcements from the platform. And I tried to get ahead of that, because that's something else you can do if you can. It's called a lead turn. My husband's a fighter pilot. My son's a fighter pilot. And when you're dogfighting, when you're flying in the air with 2 airplanes, if you make the turn first, it forces the other person to go the other way. So it's called a lead turn. And I tried to get ahead of that by going and asking the venue planner to have all the vendors shut down there just for half an hour while I spoke, and they didn't. And so I almost walked off that stage because hardly anybody could hear me. And it was so incredibly difficult to try to speak over that because I felt like I was shouting the entire time. But that's what being a professional is. You put on your big girl panties and you step up and you go ahead and deliver like you're paid to be able to deliver. Awesome. Vicki, I think Vicki had a comment about knowing the audience.
I had the opportunity to offer, oops, am I unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. To offer table topics to the Insiders Toastmasters, who's a group of inmates at our correctional institution, on Tuesday evening, and I made the mistake of asking them for a theme for the table topics, and I'm not sure it was a mistake, but it was a very interesting knowing the audience response, because they decided they wanted to talk about either the sinking of the Titanic or Mother's Day. And since it was close to Mother's Day, I went with Mother's Day, and the stories that I heard in the 1 to 2 minute responses to questions broke my heart.
Oh, yeah.
So I learned more about that audience in that session than I had known before, in terms of how broken families can really break kids.
Yeah, and I think that's incredible, Vicki, that you're doing that work, that you're working with inmates, and those are a whole different set of dynamics that you're learning about when it comes to engaging with them on a Toastmaster type of platform. One of the things that's also true is that if you're a professional speaker and you're looking to venture out into that, whenever you throw something to the audience, so like if you're, like I did throughout this speech, I asked for some feedback, I asked you guys, I just modified, and I had you raise your hands. If I were in a traditional audience, I may call on people and have them answer that way, but we modified on the fly. But keep in mind, every time you ask for the audience to respond in some way, some kind of a tangible way, like answering questions or whatever, you will lose up to a minute of your speech time.
Yeah.
Because they have to answer it. There might be this awkward pause, and then they answer, and then somebody else wants to answer, and then you have to wrestle back your platform. So be really careful if you have time constraints as to how much you throw it out to the audience, because you'll lose your ability to do that. And then also for those of you that are professionals that are venturing out into that professional realm, understand that the larger the audience, the more time you have to allow for audience reaction. So your jokes, if you don't want to speak over your audience while they're laughing, in a larger audience, you're going to have to allow for that. And during the accredited speaker presentations, I could tell the people that this was the largest audience they've ever spoken to. I'm guessing there were about maybe 500 people in the audience for accredited speaker. I could be wrong. There could have been a few more than that. But the dynamics change. In fact, I was doing a lot of speaking in this women's venue, and there were 1,000 people in the audience, and I was standing at the back of the auditorium with the event planner, and there was this woman up there speaking. He goes, "She's never spoken to more than 100 people." I said, "Really? Did you ask her?" And he goes, "No, I can tell." And I said, "How can you tell?" He says, "Because she's 10 minutes over." And she went that much over her speech because she didn't account for the larger audiences taking longer. They whisper to each other, they bond with each other, they engage, and then they start talking amongst themselves. And all of that is reaction time that will take away from your speech time.
Anybody else have any questions? Well, we will let you go, Ellie, and thank you so much for your time and for your message and for being here. It was a wonderful speech, and we really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys for having me. And if you have a link to the recording that I can populate amongst my social platforms, and it's open to the public, then we can do that as well.
We can absolutely do that.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, guys. Have a great meeting.
Thanks.
As Toastmaster, I'd like to segue us off into our 10-minute break. Yatsik and Elaine have joined me here at the Kuwaitan Library, so I will get the camera set up and have us all ready to go for Yatsik's presentation. Have a good break.
Thank you.